Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and today I'm very happy to welcome to the program historian H.W. Brands. He holds the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History at the University of Texas and Austin. He joins us for a conversation on Abraham Lincoln and John Brown. In fact, he's the author of a new book about these two individuals. It's called The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. He joins us via Zoom. H.W. Brands, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Delighted to be with you.
We've done a number of shows in the past 4 years about the political history of the Civil War, and it seems as though there has been this new interest in specifically, not necessarily the military history of the Civil War, but the political history of the Civil War, and has corresponded with the political times that we've been living through in the last 4 years. Was that all important, the political time? I'm not trying to get you to weigh in on politics one way or another, but is our current moment, did that encourage you to take up this theme about Abraham Lincoln and John Brown?
It didn't encourage me in the sense of getting this project started. I have been teaching American history for 40 years now. And anybody who teaches American history knows that some of the big questions of history focus on, events that eventually give rise to the Civil War. And they're questions that, in certain narrow senses, were resolved by the Civil War. Can a state leave the Union under the Constitution? The answer is no. So secession is off the table. But the questions that actually underlay that, so what is the balance of power between the federal government and the states? This is one we still fight over, and we're fighting over it in the middle of this pandemic. So should there be a national mandate regarding vaccines or the use of masks or something like that? Or should it be left to the states? So that's one we still deal with. And then the other unresolved question from the era of the founding was, can slavery exist within a republic? Because slavery, of course, is based on the ownership of a certain class of people, whereas a republic is based on the principle of equality of all people. So how do you deal with that? And residual to that is, what is the nature of equality in a democracy? Does everyone have equal political participation? And so the question of slavery, of course, was resolved by the Civil War and by the 13th Amendment. But the question of what does equality mean? How does equality function? We have been talking about this, of course, in the last year with various protests and conversations about race relations, about policing, about voting rights right now. Once again, we're at this point of, can the states restrict voting in a way that, basically disadvantages, if it doesn't outright disfranchise, certain groups. And so the conversations go on. So what I wanted to do actually in writing about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln was look at these questions, but look at them from a particular angle. And the angle was, sort of the moral question of what's the responsibility of a citizen in a democracy. In particular, what does the good person do in the face of evil? When a citizen of democracy sees that the government is going wrong, what's the obligation? What are the rights? What are the responsibilities of the citizen? What does the person do? And I chose John Brown and Abraham Lincoln because the two of them agreed that slavery was wrong, but they disagreed on what to do about it. So again, my question is, what does the good person do in the face of evil? And as kind of an experiment, as a historical experiment, I need to make sure that my two people agree that this thing is wrong, because the question is then, what do you do about it? So John Brown and Abraham Lincoln allowed me to examine this question in the context of slavery. And strikingly, although thousands of books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, and nowhere near that many, but a goodly number of books about John Brown, as far as I can tell, no one has zeroed in on John Brown and Abraham Lincoln together in a single book on this question. So this is the one that I wanted to consider for myself. My projects usually begin with me asking a question that I just want to know the answer to. And then if I can make it into a story, if I can make it into something that might appeal to others, then I write it up in a book. So deep background was, okay, these problems have been with America for a long time. In fact, when I was writing the book, I thought in terms of this question of what's the responsibility of the citizen in a republic? What does a good person do in the face of evil? I considered it as a timeless question. But this timeless question became surprisingly timely during the months before the book came out and since the book has come out. But I guess maybe that's the definition of a timeless, in this case, question. It's always timely.
It's always the goal if you're going to write a book to let it be still relevant, down the road in the future. That's always the hope. And of course, in some ways, it always will be, because it's also a reflection of our time. I think when we do read a history book, we need to look at it as the time that it was written in, regardless of what the topic or angle or ideology or any of that stuff. I don't mean to get us too far off topic here, but you did pique my interest when you talked about the nature of a republic and slavery. And I was wondering, is it about a republic and slavery, or is it about, and you're talking about how can you have, in a republic you have equality among people, or is it about a republic and citizenship and who qualifies as a citizen? And I ask that only because, and I don't mean to be absurd here, but I just started thinking about the ancient Roman Republic, which did have slavery in it. And I think I don't know if there are a lot of other examples of republics in the past that had slavery.
Oh, this is a very apt question. And it's one of the reasons that slavery was not a pressing issue in the first 30 or 40 years of the American Republic, precisely because it was a republic, but not a democracy. And the old Roman republics, the republics of ancient times, were entities that made no pretense of uttering total inclusion, of equality among all people under the government. There was supposed to be equality among citizens, but who the citizens were was really up for grabs. And so Roman republicans, it did not occur to them that their slaves should be citizens. It did not occur to them that women should vote. And so this question becomes really acute in the United States just at the time the United States is becoming a democratic form of a republic. In the 1780s and 1790s, even most adult white males could not vote. There were property restrictions, there were residency requirements, and there was a general feeling that in order to exercise political power, even the political power of the vote, you needed to have some material, that is, some property stake in the game. And so if you didn't have that, and if you hadn't been a resident of long standing, then you didn't have that kind of vested interest in the outcome. And so you wouldn't make a good voter. But things changed by the 1820s and 1830s. So Andrew Jackson, when he's elected in 1828, is the first president in which a popular vote is generally recorded. And so if you look at presidential elections before we'll start with 24, the one that he lost. Generally speaking, a popular vote is not recorded because the electors were mostly chosen by state legislatures. But by the 1830s, it's really clear that Americans are beginning to take seriously call it the promise or the challenge of the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal. Now, that's kind of an added twist on this, because although the Declaration of Independence is not part of the Constitution and it has no status of law under the American Constitution, it still is one of the charters of American independence. And American leaders, American elected officials, American voters are gradually compelled over time to take that seriously. So what does that mean? It's really clear from Thomas Jefferson, the author's time, that he didn't mean that all men have equal property or even an equal vote, but there's something fundamentally equal about people. Of course, he does say that all men are created equal, not necessarily that they stay equal. But nonetheless, this principle of equality, the Romans didn't believe in equality. But the United States at least claimed to in the charter of its independent birth. And in fact, one way of looking at American history is that the United States, the American people, felt obliged over the almost 2.5 centuries from 1776 until now to live up to this promise or challenge. Because again and again, when somebody thinks that situation has become, or still is, unequal, they will say, well, and look at what it says in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And so this question it partly involves slavery, but of course it also involves voting rights. And it was 50 years after African Americans were guaranteed the right to vote, at least on paper, in the 15th Amendment, that women were guaranteed the right to vote. And so we still wrestled with this question. And as I mentioned earlier, so what does it actually mean to be able to exercise the vote? Should the states be able to limit voting in such a way as to disfranchise certain people to a greater rate than others? So this is something we're still fighting with. And part of it, of course, as well, reflects the fact that we have a national government that was created out of 13 and now 50 individual states. Most other countries don't have that kind of strong federalism that we do. If you go to Britain, when the Parliament in London decides, then that applies to everybody. And the same is true in France and other places like that. This idea of a federal republic, it is kind of unwieldy. Now, there are advantages to it, of course. The United States, on the whole, the American government has served the American people quite well. It's one of we have about the longest lasting constitution in the world, if you sort of discount the British unwritten constitution. So, that can't go out of style if it's unwritten. And so it works pretty well. But one of the things that it leaves open is, well, exactly how are rights guaranteed? Even if they're written into the Constitution, which they weren't in the first place, but even if they are written into the Constitution, then how are they going to be enforced and who's going to supervise this stuff? So these are issues that are still with us and they're not going away.
What do you think's significant about the 19th century? Again, we have the rise of the abolitionist movement. We have the rise of the women's rights movements. I mean, it's in the middle of the 19th centuries. We get the Seneca Falls meeting. Recently, we talked to historian Ernest Freeburg, who wrote a biography on Henry Bergh and the rise of the animal rights movement. And he kind of pointed to maybe this is connected to industrialization, modernization. Is that what you think?
Yeah, I think that's very much at play here, because to some degree, when you talk about equality, when you talk about rights that people didn't always recognize, these are, one way of looking at them is these are luxuries that wealthy people can indulge and poor people can't. So, I mean, to take the extreme example, you mentioned animal rights. Well, if you are a tribe, a people of hunter-gatherers, if you are hunters and this is the way you live, well, you don't think in terms of the rights of the animal species that you have to kill in order to eat. And in the case of, well, something like slavery. So slavery existed from time out of mind. No one knows when slavery began because no one can identify a beginning. And it was pretty much ubiquitous in the world. Every country accepted it. And in the 18th century, it was legal in all 13 states at the time of the American Revolution. But it disappeared in the northern states, not primarily because Northerners were hit with a fit of moralism, but because the northern economies evolved in such a way that they no longer required slavery. In fact, slavery was no longer suited to them. A modern economy requires flexibility. You need to be able to hire people and lay people off. And whatever else it is and does, slavery is not flexible. You're stuck with your workers, whether you need them or not. And it was the hope of people like Abraham Lincoln, of people like Henry Clay, who was Abraham Lincoln's hero and model in politics, that the Southern economy would evolve in a similar fashion. It was behind the Northern economy in this, and that the Southern states of their own volition would vote to end slavery within their boundaries, just as the Northern states had done. You talk about women's rights. Again, the same thing. As people become wealthier, and industrialization has a role in this, because when women, for example, go to work in textile mills in New England in the 1820s and 1830s, as they go to work elsewhere in the 19th century, as they become involved in the progressive movement of the early 1900s, then they are seen as sort of more fully participating in the public life than they were when they were simply stuck at home. It's no accident that women received the vote in Western states before they received the vote in Eastern states. And this was largely because if you're out on the frontier, it's really clear that women are an essential part of whatever goes on. And by the way, it's also a way of attracting women to your state. So Wyoming was the first state that enfranchised women, and the whole part of the idea was, if we tell women they can vote in Wyoming, then they're going to come to Wyoming rather than to Colorado or somewhere else.
Let's get to the heart of the story that you tell about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, and I might do it in a roundabout way here by telling you a quick story. I was once a Capitol Hill correspondent, and I go back regularly to the Hill. And I remember at the beginning of the Trump years, really within the first 100 days, I went back to Washington, D.C., and just 'cause I was trying to get a grip. Like, what in the world is happening? Let me go to D.C. so I can get a handle on what's going on. And I got there, and clearly nobody knew what was going on, you know?
Right.
And I sat down with Senate historian Betty Coed, and my listeners will be tired of me telling this story. And I just looked at her and I said, can you think of another crazy, wild political time like the one we're living through now? And she just laughed at me and she said, yes, of course, the 1850s, the decade before the Civil War. This is really where your story is taking place, the 1850s.
Yeah. So actually, I have a similar reaction to this that an earlier book that I wrote a few years ago was on, well, it's called Heirs of the Founders, and it was on the generation of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John Calhoun. And it culminates in the 1850s. And the book, The Zealot and the Emancipator, on John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, is essentially a sequel to that. And when I was working on that book and when I was working on this book, people would raise this question: have you ever seen the country so divided? Have you ever seen such violent rhetoric and all this other stuff going on? And I say, yeah. And in fact, the way I couch things is I would say, I've been to the 19th century and I return with good news and bad news. The good news is that the country experienced and survived a period of worse polarization, of worse political rhetoric and violence. That's the good news. The bad news is it took a civil war. And I certainly hope, and I believe that we're not on the verge of a civil war. So to say that things were worse in the 1850s is not exactly a recommendation for today, considering what was required to resolve, or at least to suppress, those differences. But yeah, it was the most politically violent time in American history.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with H.W. Brands. He holds the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin. We are in conversation about his book, The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. Let's have a little background sketch, especially about John Brown. John Brown is mostly remembered for the failed raid on Harper's Ferry, and which at the time was Virginia, now it's West Virginia, in 1859. He would be executed for that failed raid, and that's what we know about John Brown. What's not as well known and is before then, and what was happening in the 1850s, and especially what was happening in modern day Kansas. And it was this, what they called Kansas bleeding, which was really this kind of guerrilla warfare that was playing out in the state over slavery. This is where John Brown really kind of enters the national imagination, isn't it?
Yeah. So if you want to get a sense of what was going on in Kansas, imagine if the Proud Boys and the Antifas showed up in the thousands and they were all heavily armed and they were shooting at each other on a regular basis. Then that's what was happening in Kansas. Now, the issue that divided them was slavery. And they were in Kansas because Kansas territory had just been created. So Kansas, the region, had been given a territorial government on the principle of popular sovereignty, which meant that anybody, slaveholder, opponent of slavery, could go to Kansas territory with his or her property. From the Northerners, the anti-slavery folks, this meant they could take their horses and their cows. For the slaveholders from the South, it meant they could take their horses and their cows and their slaves. And the idea was that they would come and When Kansas Territory finally had enough people in it, 60,000, to qualify for statehood, they would get together and they would hold a constitutional convention, state convention. And then at that time, they would decide, do we want Kansas to be a free state or a slave state? Well, this seemed on paper like a basically democratic way to do it. But what it meant in practice was there was every incentive for both the pro-slavery party, that is side in the United States, and the anti-slavery side to get as many people into Kansas as possible, to claim all the good land and to discourage their opponents from coming. And within months, fighting broke out among these different groups, in many cases because many of those people going to Kansas were not bona fide settlers. They were there basically as volunteers in this fight. And the the pro-slavery side had an advantage in that Kansas is right next door to Missouri, and Missouri is a slave state. And the pro-slavery groups from Missouri could simply ride across the border into Kansas and do whatever they want to do and ride home and be in their own beds by nightfall. Because the part of Kansas that was first settled, not surprisingly, was the eastern part, the part closest to the eastern part of the United States. The anti-slavery side had a bit of a disadvantage because most of the anti-slavery settlers had to cross Missouri to get there.
They were coming from New England.
They were coming from New England. They're coming from upstate New York. They're coming from Ohio. They're coming from various places. And so they had a disadvantage, but they were motivated by opposition to slavery. They were motivated in many cases by their understanding, their interpretation of their religion, and say, okay, this is equality for freedom and all of this stuff. And they got in fights. John Brown went to Kansas Territory. At this point, he was living in upstate New York. He had been born in Connecticut. His family moved when he was a small boy to Ohio, and he grew up in Ohio. And then he lived in Ohio until his 40s, when he gradually became an abolitionist. And he decided to move to an abolitionist community in upstate New York, which was kind of an experimental commune where individuals were, especially Black people, were given farmland in order to demonstrate that they could succeed just as well as white people. One of the charges that was made by the apologists of slavery at this time was that Black people were simply incapable of succeeding on their own. They needed the guidance of slaveholders and so on. And the colony at North Elba in upstate New York was demonstrating that that was false. Anyway, so fighting breaks out in Kansas, and John Brown goes with 4 of his adult sons. John Brown had lots of children. He had 20 children by 2 wives. And so 4 of the adult sons go, and they're going to take up arms in defense of freedom as they saw it. Well, after one particularly egregious attack by the pro-slavery side on what was called a free state settlement, that is a settlement of the anti-slavery side at Lawrence, Kansas, John Brown decided that the pro-slavery settlers have to be sent a message. And so in the dark of one night, John Brown led a small band of his followers to a hamlet, a small community on the banks of Pottawatomie Creek in eastern Kansas. And they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers, men, from their beds. And in the dead of night, they butcher them. They chop them to pieces with broadswords. Then, and especially now, this would be called an act of terrorism. The whole point was to send a political message by violence. And the message that John Brown wanted to send was, this could happen to you, you apologists of slavery, if you come to Kansas. Again, what was going on in Kansas was this competition to see who would get the most settlers there. And John Brown was demonstrating that if you're in favor of slavery and you come to Kansas, this could happen to you. John Brown became notorious at that point, although he pretty much fell off the radar. In those days, there was no common photography, so there were no wanted posters of John Brown in the post offices because nobody knew what he looked like. There were descriptions, but John Brown was fairly nondescript. He could cut his hair and grow his beard and change his name, and he did all that. He was also very good at taking on other personas. Here's an ironic thing about this, that John Brown made many people believe in his sincerity, that he really believed this stuff. But half the time he was play acting. And so when he would present himself as just this mild-mannered surveyor, and he could, walk through any group of pro-slavery people, it was quite remarkable. But anyway, at this point, John Brown is wanted for murder. And he's traveling around the country on the lam, and he's trying to avoid arrest, but he's also trying to raise money for his bigger operation. And this is the raid on Harper's Ferry. And so John Brown raises money. He talks to philanthropists, abolitionist philanthropists in the Boston area in upstate New York, and he gets them to sign on to this project. And well, they don't know exactly what they're signing on. He certainly leads them to believe that he's going back to Kansas and he's fighting against the expansion of slavery, when in fact he's planning this big raid on Harper's Ferry. And so the raid on Harper's Ferry, the goal of the raid on Harper's Ferry is to strike such a blow against slavery that the institution will be shaken and eventually will crumble under its own weight. The idea was to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, this warehouse full of arms, and to distribute the arms among the enslaved young men of the area, people of military age and capability, that they would rise up violently against their masters and they would strike for their freedom. In effect, John Brown was trying to start a servile insurrection, a slave insurrection. He's trying to start a war. He failed. He didn't start the war, nor did he free any slaves. But in being arrested, as he was, captured, arrested, tried, he stated very eloquently, and the more eloquently for the fact that his life was on the line, the case of the abolitionists. He was duly convicted of treason against the Commonwealth, the state of Virginia, and of murder in the deaths of several people killed in the raid on Harper's Ferry, and was executed. But on his way to the gallows, he slipped a note to his jailer that said, "The sins of this country will not be washed away except by blood." Now, when the word of John Brown's raid hit the South, Southerners, especially white slaveholders, were outraged and terrified. They were terrified from the fact that, boy, if this slave rebellion had succeeded, they might all be dead within a matter of days. And it outraged them that the North was allowing this to happen, because this raid was staged from Pennsylvania into Virginia. And the Southerners were enraged even more when Northerners, especially Northern abolitionists, praised John Brown as a martyr to the cause. Imagine if in the aftermath of 9/11, when this gang of terrorists kills thousands of Americans, imagine if a substantial portion of the United States had said, yay for them, they were doing the right thing. You can imagine what the outrage would be. And that's exactly how Southerners felt. So the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry was by no means the sole cause of the Civil War, but it was one of those last elements in a chain of events that caused many Southerners to conclude that they and their domestic institution, slavery, would not be safe as long as their states remained in the Union.
I had read, and I think this might be W.B. Du Bois's biography on John Brown, that John Brown's plan with Harper's Ferry was to be able to escape to some nearby mountain and hold that mountain to create a new republic or something like that.
Yeah. So in the best case scenario, John Brown explained to people and explained to himself that in fact, this uprising needn't be all that violent. In fact, the slaves would take the weapons and they would run, or they would fight their way to strongholds in the Allegheny Mountains, in the mountains sort of in the western part of Virginia. And there they would be able to defend themselves against anybody coming after them. Well, John Brown was certainly kidding himself if he believed that this was going to happen without a lot of violence. There had been slave uprisings in the past. And the one that was a sort of recent memory in Virginia was the Nat Turner Rebellion of the early 1830s, in which a relatively small group of slaves killed more than 100 people. And it led to a backlash in which several hundred black people, or a few hundred black people, were killed. So there was no way that what John Brown was imagining was going to take place without violence. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons that John Brown's raid failed. So there's a poignant and revealing moment ahead of the raid when John Brown is trying to persuade Frederick Douglass, the noted abolitionist and former slave himself, to join the raid. And Brown basically says, Fred, if you come along with us, then it's going to give this project, this plan, much more credibility than would have otherwise, because people, the slaves that we're reaching out to, would see that you're part of it and you think it's a good idea. And Douglass said no. And part of the reason was, the main reason was, he knew it was a really bad idea. He knew, first of all, that, it just didn't suit his talents. He had fled for his own freedom, but he was a writer. He was not a fighter. But the deeper problem was, he knew that the enslaved peoples that John Brown was appealing to would simply not join in, because they weren't going to throw their lives away. They knew, for example, that any slave, Virginia, like the other slave states, who even touched a weapon, as soon as they picked up that weapon, they would have committed what amounted to a capital crime. And any white person would have authority and freedom to kill them right away. And so if John Brown was thinking that somehow white slave owners were just going to let their slaves go and establish these strongholds in the mountains, he was not thinking very clearly, because at the very least, the militia of the slave states would mount an attack on those places, and there would be the war. So I don't think that John Brown seriously believed that this would happen without a great deal of violence. I think by this time, John Brown was he was certainly willing to run the risk of violence. I'm not going to go so far as to say he welcomed violence, but considering his own background, that's not an outlandish claim to make.
You begin your book, The Zealot and the Emancipator, talking about a letter while in jail, either during the trial or right before his execution, after the failed raid on Harper's Ferry, a letter he's writing to his wife, informing her that their son, at least one son, had died. He lost sons in this struggle.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so John Brown is in the process of slowly realizing something very important about his historical role, his place in history. In Kansas, in planning the raid on Harper's Ferry, John Brown believed that he was going to be of great use to the abolitionist movement living. But after he was captured, as he could see that he was going to be tried and convicted and executed, he came to realize that he that was of greater value to the abolitionist movement dead than alive. That his soul, the soul that goes marching on, as was said in the John Brown's Body song, that's what was really going to motivate people. And there is this kind of, I infer this by reading John Brown's letters, including the one you cite to his wife and his children, that a kind of calm comes over John Brown. He realizes that things have gotten out of his control. The only thing that he control now is his response, his reactions to the things that are happening to him. He can't change the broader world. He can't free slaves by his actions. He can't deter slaveholders by killing them. But what he can do is give the example of someone who is willing to give his life for this cause. And it really was a remarkable thing about John Brown. He had some kind of charisma. He caused people to follow him. He had no military training, but he led this band of soldiers, guerrilla soldiers, guerrilla fighters, who were willing to follow him. And he could cause even people who fundamentally disagreed with him to believe that there was something really, really praiseworthy about John Brown. The governor of Virginia raced to Harper's Ferry and then to the jail in the town next door to see who this guy was who was trying to overthrow his state. And he was quite taken by John Brown. He became almost a defender of John Brown. So Brown had this ability, and despite the fact that, I guess it comes from the fact that he is about to die. And so he's sort of at peace with this. John Brown had been an activist before this, but strikingly, the greatest contribution he makes to the abolitionist movement is a very passive kind of role, as he lets the wheels, he can't stop it, but the wheels of justice grind and they carry him off and finally do make, well, in the views of the other abolitionists, a martyr out of him.
John Brown is a very religious man. He sees himself as a soldier for God, doesn't he? Talk to me about his background. How does he become a person a little bit later in life? I think earlier you said 37 years old or so, right? When, he starts getting into these acts to end slavery. Before that, he was a failed businessman, basically. Talk to me about his background, about how he gets to be who he would become and forever remembered and talked about 160 years later.
At a very basic level, John Brown found his calling the way a whole lot of people find their callings, by process of elimination. If John Brown had been a successful farmer, successful businessman, if he had been good at herding sheep or cattle or speculating in land, he probably never would have wound up where he did. But part of this too was that John Brown was someone who was not interested in amassing wealth. He needed something that really spoke to his spirit in a way just the mundane activities of life did. And John Brown had discovered or concluded as a boy that slavery was wrong, but he didn't know what to do about it. It wasn't until he was in his late 30s that he heard that an abolitionist editor had been murdered in Illinois. And John Brown thought, this shows that slavery, the slave power, as it was often characterized, was going too far. A man, even in a free state like Illinois, cannot speak his mind without being killed by the slave power. And at that point, John Brown stood up in his church. He was living in the town of Hudson in Ohio. And he stood up in his church in Hudson, Ohio. And he said, here before the eyes of God, in front of my congregation, I pledge to devote the rest of my life to the struggle against slavery. Even then, he didn't know exactly what that struggle meant. He participated in the Underground Railroad. He thought about starting a school for Black children. But it wasn't until the opening of Kansas with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And even then, he had to be urged to go to Kansas by his adult sons, that when he finally got on the field of battle, when he could engage directly in this way, that said, aha, this is what I was meant to do. So I would say with John Brown, it wasn't religion that drove him to abolitionism, but once his moral sensibility came to the conclusion that abolitionism was the only appropriate response. And here I point out, abolitionism is not simply opposition to slavery. It's the belief that slavery is so wrong that ending slavery overrides all other considerations, even the law, even the Constitution. And so once John Brown came to that conclusion, then his life has its meaning. And then he can read the Bible in a way that justifies his actions. It's worth noting, and many people in John Brown's day did note, that slave owners read their Bible too. And slavery is everywhere in the Old Testament. And St. Paul in the New Testament tells slaves, obey your masters. So the Bible on this issue, as on many others, can be read to justify diametrically opposed positions.
You bring up an important point that gets, again, to sort of what your book is about, The Zealot and the Emancipator, is that the distinction between being an abolitionist and being anti-slavery and against slavery. There was a distinction. How you talked about the fallout of, especially from the South after the failed raid on Harper's Ferry. The South was squarely putting that and blaming a nascent Republican Party that was poised to be led by Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 election. Tell me about that dynamic.
Yeah, so Abraham Lincoln was opposed to slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. Time and again, he said, I'm not an abolitionist. Time and again, he said that although I am opposed to slavery on principle, I believe that the Constitution does not allow the federal government, certainly does not allow the President of the United States to end slavery in the states where it continues to exist. That's a matter for the citizens of those states. And so when the raid on Harper's Ferry became known, and when John Brown was seen as the instigator of this, Abraham Lincoln, who by this time was seeing himself as the next presidential nominee of the Republican Party, because the parade on Harper's Ferry is the autumn of 1859. There will be a presidential election in 1860. Lincoln is looking good because he's a moderate Republican. There were Republicans who were more strongly anti-slavery than Abraham Lincoln, but they tended to alarm even Republicans, because most Republicans didn't want slavery to cause a war. Most Republicans, and the Republican Party was an entirely Northern and Western party. There weren't any Republicans in the South. And even though they were opposed to slavery, they didn't think it was worth a war over. And this is really important to Lincoln. Lincoln recognizes this as an aspiring president, as an ambitious politician, but it also accorded with his belief that what made freedom for anybody in the United States possible was the Constitution. And as long as the Constitution, which prescribed the Union, as long as that held firm, then freedom could survive. But if the Constitution failed, if the Union fell apart, then the world would conclude that people simply cannot govern themselves. Because as late as 1860, democracy in the United States was this rare thing. Democracy hadn't caught on pretty much anywhere else. And most of the countries of Europe, for example, thought that democracy wouldn't catch on and should not catch on, because they thought democracy, what do ordinary people know about running their own affairs? And this is why Lincoln insisted on preserving the Union and the Constitution, because if the Union failed, if the Constitution failed, then, as Lincoln put it in his Gettysburg Address, then the world would discover that government of the people, by the people, for the people, indeed would perish from the earth. And so much more was at stake than just slavery. This is why Lincoln kept the Constitution as a higher priority than ending slavery. He wanted slavery to end, but if ending slavery broke up the Constitution, broke up the Union, he wanted no part of it. It's worth noting that some of the abolitionists were advocating that the North should secede from the South. And that way, Northerners would no longer feel any sense of responsibility for the horrible slavery practices of the South. Now, one can understand their desire to wash their hands, but you do have to point out that this isn't going to do slaves any good. It's not going to free any slaves. And if anything, it will eliminate any leverage the North would have upon the South.
And in some ways, the North was implicit. I mean, economically speaking, they were integrated. You had insurance companies in the North putting out, insurance plans for slave owners and the enslaved people that they had.
I mean, that's certainly true, that the American economy was a single economy. And so what profited the South sent some of the profits to the North. And that was utterly unremarkable in the 19th century. And of course, from the perspective of the 21st century, from our perspective, everybody was complicit in slavery. Well, that's exactly true. But kind of if you look at it from the other direction, in 1750, everybody was complicit in slavery. Everybody owned slaves. I exaggerate here, but there was no part of the country that didn't own slaves. Nobody wanted to be a slave, but that's just one of those unfortunate things in life. By 1850, half the country was saying, slavery is not right. Now, that's more people than said that in 1750. By 1950, everybody would say that slavery was wrong. Yeah. So, the fact that Northern insurance companies, Northern ship owners, shipping companies, all this were involved. Yeah, it's certainly true. And it's also, of course, that's just the way the world works. That's certainly the way it seemed at the time.
About this debate, and I don't mean pro-slavery and anti-slavery, let's put the pro-slavery people to the side, but this debate that you get at in your book concerning what to do about slavery, represented on one side by John Brown, on the other side by Abraham Lincoln. Is this an active debate that is occurring?
In the 1850s, the answer to that is yes, but the people who are siding with John Brown are a small minority, even of the Northern population. There's nobody in the South who agrees with it. There are some people in the South who would be glad to see slavery go away, but they're kind of keeping quiet because it was a very unpopular position in the South. In the North, most people were mildly opposed to slavery, sort of mildly opposed to slavery as in it's kind of distasteful. up to the radical abolitionists who believe that slavery ought to end today, and that John Brown's their hero. And Lincoln is kind of midway on that spectrum. He's taken a public position, but it's really crucial to see how this plays out with Lincoln. Because, for example, once 7 at first, and then finally 11 Southern states secede from the Union, Lincoln insists that they may not leave. And he makes very clear, however, that when he asks for volunteers to preserve the Union, the volunteers are to preserve the Union. He doesn't ask for volunteers to end slavery. For Lincoln, the war is not about slavery, at least not at first. He eventually comes around to the conclusion that winning the war requires ending slavery, or at least in those states that have rebelled against the national government. But as late as the summer of 1862, Lincoln makes very clear in a public letter where he says that my job is to preserve the Union. If I do that by freeing the slaves or not freeing the slaves or freeing half of them, leave the other half, I'll do whatever is necessary. My job is to save the Union. Eventually, he comes around. Now, during this early period, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass are loudly berating Lincoln. Wait a minute. Don't you see that to save the Union, you have to free the slaves? At first, Lincoln didn't agree with that. And in fact, the evidence was on Lincoln's side at first because Lincoln's election provoked the secession of 7 Southern slave states. But that meant that there were 8 slave states that had not seceded. They were still part of the Union. And so Lincoln wanted to keep them in the Union. Now, after fighting began in South Carolina at Fort Sumter, then 4 other states seceded. But there were still 4 of the slave states who didn't leave the Union. And Lincoln wanted to reassure them that he was not declaring war on them. This war was about the Union. It wasn't about slavery. As I say, he gradually saw that preserving the Union required ending slavery.
This morning, before our interview, as I was having breakfast, I was thinking about this dynamic of this debate of what you do about slavery if you're against slavery and how far you are willing to go. And I thought to myself, well, they didn't have a Martin Luther King Jr., preaching the practice of civil, of nonviolent protest, or a Mahatma Gandhi. But then when I thought about it more, I was like, well, wait a minute, maybe they did. Because both Gandhi and King were heavily influenced by the essay from Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience. And what's really interesting about that is not only does Henry David Thoreau give us this great essay that would still be used for nonviolent protest up till today, but on the other hand, he was also one of the biggest defenders, public defenders, of John Brown as the trial was occurring.
Yeah, so Thoreau and the other abolitionists of that Concord Boston circle are very interesting in this because Thoreau's a good one for civil disobedience. And the whole point is civil. You don't take up arms. You get yourself arrested, for not paying taxes or whatever it is, and you accept the punishment. And that's what Thoreau did. And that's what Thoreau wrote about and advised people to do. But he just fell head over heels for John Brown, in part because he recognized that John Brown was the kind of person Thoreau wasn't and could never be. That Thoreau wrote and he spoke, but he didn't act. And very often, people who speak and write are in awe of the people who act, because at a very basic level, I think they often ask themselves, am I that brave? Would I be willing to put my life on the line for this thing that I'm writing and talking about all the time? And so with Thoreau, Thoreau's an interesting character. And he took the advice of Emerson, says that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. And Thoreau could be on both sides of an issue when it came down to something like that. But it is interesting that, that Brown became a hero to this group, none of whom would pick up arms and do this kind of thing. But it's precisely because they recognized in Brown that he was somebody who had the courage of their convictions. when they didn't have that own courage themselves.
H.W. Brands has been our guest. He is a historian at the University of Texas at Austin. He has joined us for a conversation about his book. It's called The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. H.W. Brands, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you dearly for taking this time to join us today.
It was great to talk to you. Keep up the good work.